Here's an interesting quote from Federalist 59, written by Alexander Hamilton in touching upon issues that relate to the size of a legislature and the legislature that is both functional, meaning that it can actually produce public policy that successfully addresses real crises within the electorate, and also fairly represents constituents. And he writes that the more numerous are the numbers of a body, quote, the greater is known to be the ascendancy of passion over reason, end quote. So here there is tension between representation in a democratic sense, and the idea that if you have too many people in a constituency and only one representative, because the United States has single member districts, this means that effectively you're not going to be that well represented. One, because you have districts that are presumably large, meaning that they cover a broad area, and that there's probably enough diversity between the number of people who live there that one voice is not going to be able to represent them all, and is simply just not going to be able to account for different conflicting interests. And the fact that you have different and conflicting interests means that there's not going to be one good advocacy position that represents the district as a whole to begin with, but also on a more ideological level, you're increase the likelihood that whoever your representative is not going to agree with your ideological position, meaning that your set of values is probably not represented in Congress, which is a good and a bad thing. It's not a bad thing if we have an extremely limited federal government and there are very narrow grounds on which the federal government is legislating, but as we know, that's not what's happening now. We have an incredibly broad federal power that sticks its nose into every business. So the idea that you don't have actual representation in Congress is going to contribute to high levels of political inefficacy and is also going to lead to legislation that is ideologically swayed one way or another, thus further creating problems. And the idea then would be, since America has become so large and since there's not necessarily a good fit between constituents and their representatives, well, politics is dysfunctional. Let's fix that dysfunction by making it so that we have more representatives. But if we do that, if we increase the size of Congress, we're not actually solving that problem, because we get back to Hamilton's idea that the more people you have, the less likely it is that you're going to have rational debate, and the more likely it is that you're going to elect people who simply represent interest groups and who are then going to make emotionalistic and sophistic arguments about how public policy would be grounded. Now, in a certain sense, that's not a bad thing, right? Polarization is a dirty word in American politics, and it really shouldn't be, because if there are genuine differences in how people think and what their on-the-ground situations are, then this is something that should be reflected in American politics. But if we're then going to translate that onto the national stage and create a politics that is sort of a mirror, but on a smaller scale, of the different factions that exist within the polity, and we're going to promote this multiplicity of interests, which Madison writes about in the Federalist Papers, and which is a benefit because it's another check on Congress. And if you have this multiplicity of interests who are all competing in Congress and are then creating competition and creating dialogue, then this is also going to lead to a politics that is as dysfunctional, because it means that more debate is going to occur, and it's not necessarily going to be rational debate, because you're going to have people who are going to stick to their interests. Now, the solution to this really should be not that we create a federalistic or a federal politics that reflects localities, but rather that power should be transferred back to localities. Because a dysfunctional federal government is not necessarily a bad thing. A dysfunctional federal government means that government is not infringing on your rights because it's not doing anything. However, when you have a federal government imbued with broad and sweeping powers, as we do now, you have a government that is then responsible for all of these issues, but is not doing anything to solve them. And this is a problem because it means that not only are rights being infringed on, but the government services which it has said that it will provide for people are not being enacted and needs are not being fulfilled. So now you've made the problem doubly worse. So if instead we take that power away from the federal government and devolve it down to local levels, you're still going to have that multiplicity of factions, but you are going to deal with the issue of size, because if you're in localities, they're generally smaller anyway. And yes, you're going to have people who are self-interested and who are very strongly attached to their own hierarchy of values and to this schema of needs. But because people are in localities where they're forced to interact with the same people who are then enacting political solutions, there is that extra level of motivation to cast aside more emotionalistic rhetoric and to instead look at the on-the-ground facts and make what are going to be difficult decisions and are certainly going to mean that certain needs aren't addressed through local government, although that doesn't mean that they can't be addressed by different social organizations. But it does mean that reason is more likely to prevail. And it's going to prevail in part because when you have local politics, the success or failure of different policy prescriptions is much more obvious. And when things do go wrong and solutions that are enacted don't work, you have people who are then going to be angry and upset and who are going to enact their revenge upon their legislature. And this takes place in a situation that is going to be emotionalistic, but is also going to be an emotion tempered by rationality and an emotion that is channeled through reason, meaning that that anger is going to be directed at specific failures, at specific instances where politicians have maybe said one thing and then aren't going to do it. So in that case, it's anger at a lie or anger at something that hasn't worked as it said it's going to be. So that emotion is actually rooted in an objective, rational process. And that's not necessarily the case in Congress. Clearly, that is not the case, period, in Congress, because what we have is emotionalistic reason or emotionalistic rhetoric totally unhinged from any sort of objective facts that back that up.